Hi, I'm Thaddeus McNamara, and until recently, I was the Senior Information Suppression Officer working across international jurisdictions to ensure that space information, what was going on up there in space, wasn't being available for you down here in this space. My role was to keep you in the dark about what was going on in the dark up there while you were remaining down here. And one result of me doing this work in suppressing information across all of those countries was that I became profoundly familiar with magnetic tape storage. And I will go much further into that. However, instead of being poisoned or given, mouth or throat cancer like the good old days, the cleanup agent associated with these sorts of operations is a 7-foot tall, Lego-loving, angry man who is only being funded to end people using irregular shaped vegetables. This is what defunding does, and I'm honestly terrified of this gentleman, especially given that he's only authorized to fly economy these days. So while this individual has his last hour of a 12-hour flight, while being right next to a mother with a newborn in the middle seat while she has the aisle seat, and the person sitting to his right has their shoes off, I'm going to take advantage of it to tell you the story from the start of how it started. And it started with the name Poulsen. The man's name was Poulsen. Valdemir Poulsen. And he managed to work out that if you magnetized a wire hard enough, you could record a message on it. So Valdemir had this great idea, which was if you tried to call someone and they didn't answer their phone, you could leave a short message that would be stored on a magnetized wire. He didn't realize that in the future we would be wasting thousands and thousands and thousands of gigabytes of storage on voicemail messages that would never be listened to, or that could have been summarized in an SMS. Poulsen had worked out that you could take a magnetized wire, which was able to then have the waveform of sound imprinted upon it. And the next step after that was to go, well, if it didn't have to be the whole wire, why not take some form of ribbon or tape that's been doped with a magnetic substrate and imprint the waveform on it instead. Thus, we ended up with more voicemail messages. The basic mechanism of a magnetic tape to store data or analog information on it, you have a string, ribbon, a simple fine element, and it is coated with a magnetic substrate which you set all of the poles of the magnets to one particular direction. Then, if it's analog data, you will apply a waveform over it which changes the magnetic response to roughly be whatever waves you want to imprint on it. In terms of digital data, it's actually much more simple. You will make it a yes or a no, a binary 1 or 0, and have it switched on or off. Binary always comes down to 1s and 0s, on or offs. There are advantages to it, but there are overheads to it. We know this. Anyway, in the earliest days of magnetic media being used, we put analog data onto it. It's interesting describing analog as data because it is very rich. So if you have a tape that's moving at a particular speed over a write head, then the speed that it is moving at and representing the waveforms, be it a light waveform or a sound waveform, onto the tape medium itself, that is its sampling rate. And that can be very low. Cassettes. Wait, we should talk about the different types of media here before I start going too far. If we go back to the earliest tape media, it was generally an audio medium. What was done is that you had a reel-to-reel tape recorder. It took a waveform similar to what they were already imprinting to records, but instead of imprinting it to a physical medium, they imprinted it to a magnetic medium. This was used for reel-to-reel tape for a large number of years. There was a blues musician. He was the first person to buy a tape recorder, and the truth is, he was sick of fucking doing live performances. So he bought the earliest audio tape recorder, used it so that he didn't have to work. And, like, props to Bing Crosby on this one. Can you imagine being so good at what you do that instead of turning up for work or even hypothesizing that work is where you need to go, but instead buying out an entire technology that's emerging at the moment so that you can record magnetic tape versions of your performance, which is what you're getting paid for, so you can stay at home rather than actually have to do live performances, which is what you're getting fucking paid for. Bing. Man of my heart. It wasn't too long after we worked out that we could encode a waveform of sound onto a magnetic tape that we also worked out that we could encode onto a magnetic tape multiple waveforms of light, video. So suddenly, instead of having film, which was a literal imprint of the negative or the positive of frames, photographs, what we're able to do was represent them with data, but not yet digital data, analog data, referencing what we wanted to show on a screen. We would take a ribbon or tape, as we talked about before, doped in a magnetic film, and we would play that through a record head. And often we'd use parallel layering to go, okay, here are our different types of waveform, and then we'd have read heads that were stacked in order to be able to understand them. A good way of explaining this using just a single type of waveform is a 4-track recorder that used a cassette. Taking that cassette, and instead of having 2 sides to it, it would use the entire width of the tape and split it into 2 tracks, one on each side of the cassette. That cassette would then have a set of waveforms for each track that was recorded to it. A 60-minute cassette that would be flipped and usually become 120 minutes long had 60 minutes of 4 tracks of different audio recording. And because the piece of equipment in question knew to divide the physical layering of the tape, it could rewrite and overdub those portions of the tape with different sounds. Now, if you took 2 stereo tracks and some video space, you now have a video magnetic tape. While you're laying down all of that interesting waveform or digital sound, you've got to understand that tape has a baseline noise to it. So in addition to all of those useful tracks, you've got to reserve, if you're doing it as well as you possibly can, a little bit of bandwidth for metadata. One of those metadatas is that you run a high hertz, you run a meta signal. You run along that line. You run along that particular part of the track a signal that indicates the difference between 0 and the baseline recording. Therefore, you can always identify some degree of inherent noise because of the fact that you've got a constant wee or similar versus a background. Oh. Sing it with me. Oh. But you get the idea. There's always going to be inherent background noise, and there's a signal baseline, and if you do the differential between them, you're fine. This is where analog, it was very cheap, it was very easy to do, but at the end of the day, when it came to digital data, it was actually much better because it's more resilient. Rapid fire time! I'm going to run through the magnetic tape evolution very quickly, but I wanted to give you the overview of all the different types as quickly as I could. And I will be reading them off of a note sheet because I'm not that bright. Starting in 1898, we had the wire. 1928, we had paper ribbon-based magnetic audio. 1947, the first Ampex model tape recorder happened. In 1951, the first data tapes for a computer existed. And in 1963, the first compact cassette came out. In 1964, the 8-track. 1965, the U-matic failed. Fuck you, Sony, you failed. Betamax came into existence in 1975 and failed not much after. The digital audio tape, the DAT, which is still used behind the scenes in all of your favorite bands today, came into existence in 1987. In 1995, the digital linear tape came to be. In 1998, the LTO, digital magnetic tape for doing backups that we still have today, came into existence. And although there has been significant upgrades on most of these since then, the truth is, it's still just tape. Just tape. I probably should have mentioned the Video 8 format from Sony in there. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have a lot of people injuring themselves on tape. A lot of people hurt themselves while using that particular format to record their skateboarding or base jumping or motorcycle riding or fireworks fun. So one thing that has made digital more robust than analog in the magnetic tape space is that, as I was talking earlier about the different waveforms for a 4-track tape, for example, being used, what we can do with an LTO or similar data digital magnetic tape is cut it into lanes. Got your strips down the width of the tape. What that allows for is multiplexing of sorts, so that you can store bands. If you were to, for instance, take 8 bands on a piece of tape, you're storing a byte for every iteration of the tape sampling speed. Now, if that is further encoded, for instance, instead using plexed 1 to 4 or similar, then suddenly you're storing a byte on half of a band, ... We know that digital sampling is lossy as a rule of thumb. However, not when you're talking about pure data. If you're looking at video and if you're looking at audio, yeah, okay, you've got sampling rates and all of that. But if you're looking at pure database backups, you can take your 8 lanes of tape, multiplex them out by 4, blah, 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 blah. It gets very big, very, very fast. Although you can't necessarily seek a particular piece of data on a tape, the volume of data that you can store on a tape can often be very, very, very large. Now, there was a time where some dickhead decided to attach something to a pigeon and fucking send it and compared it to the ADSL transfer speed and fucking whatever. That did result in the idea that there is more bandwidth in a disk in a truck than there is in the internet. And this is actually quite true. If you get really large virtual machines snapshotted onto high capacity LTOs, and depending on the distance they need to go, just ship the fucking tapes, then really all you're looking at is the difference between A and B faster than you ever could have transferred all that over any of the internet pipelines, especially now that some dickhead with a fucking submarine keeps cutting them off. There is still wisdom in that a tape in a truck or a plane may or may not, but may be faster than the internet. Clearly, I think tape is superior. Why not paint ribbons with magnets? What could go wrong? Thaddeus, I hear you say. If it's so good, what could go wrong? Well, a few things actually. And let's start with, in my own defense, I actually had no idea which one of these catastrophic fuck-ups I was going to start with. I'm not sure which one I want to go with now. In terms of my obligatory pop culture reference, I bet you'd think that I'd go for something like Guardians of the Galaxy, which was pretty great in terms of the mixtapes. Or maybe The Ring, because of the VHS tapes, The Creepy Bird. Maybe Videodrome, because it's a good film. But no, I've got one for you, and you should all be ashamed for how badly this is rated. It's Airheads. Let's start with the fact that it is a Brendan Fraser, Steve Buscemi, Adam Sandler movie. It has Chris Farley in it, and it is about a bunch of dead shits who try to take over a radio station so they can get their demo tape played. Now, the first tape is a reel-to-reel tape which gets cooked because Steve Buscemi's character can't not fucking smoke a ciggy. Now, that happens, but also Adam Sandler's character can't not fucking work a reel-to-reel. Look, let's move on. The second part is about a cassette tape, which his challenging girlfriend has thrown out of the car, had banged on by some good air suspension, pissed on by a dog, and they bring it to the studio. But the bottom line is, it was one of the few things that Kramer did before he started getting gamer-wordy. Let's ignore that. Let's go back to Airheads. It's Steve Buscemi, Adam Sandler, and Brendan Fraser as a three-piece rock metal band. If they did that, the only thing that would make it better would be having either Rob Zombie, who cameoed, or Lemmy, who also cameoed, come in there as a watch Airheads. Fuck you. Airheads is good. I still want to make Stretch Armstrong. So I did promise that I would talk about some of the things that I made go away. The Landsat data from NASA was probably the easiest. All that took was a little bit of bullshit. Some of it was recovered, but at the end of the day, what we talk about in this space is technological amnesia. Space shuttle data, gone. Totally my work. You'd be proud. I'm older than I look. I got rid of the space shuttle data. I got rid of the Landsat data. I got rid of the Mars data. The Mars data was particularly interesting. I made it go away. It wasn't just the fact that we used incompatible magnetic tapes that could never be read again, or that those magnetic tapes were stored in high humidity or mold growing environments that led to the ribbon/paper layers being separated, degradation of the oxide layers, which is so common. That never happened. These things never happened like that. The Apollo 11 data, that was before my time, but it did lead to the handbook on how to manipulate the magnetic data. You got to think about this. Aliens are totally out there, and we are keeping them out of your minds. And we're doing it manipulating VHS tapes. What was really interesting about the Viking data that we destroyed was that it aligned heavily with the Sphinx flood data. There was a lot of water in both cases. And if you don't think that I'm serious about this, have a look at what Bass F, who was one of the original contributors to magnetic audio tapes back in the day, does today. They have their chemical fingers in all of the chemical pies. Couple of fun whoopsie doodles that occurred through the course of using magnetic media. One particular recording studio that will remain unnamed for the sake of pride made the great idea that as a form of DRM, they would record everybody at a different speed on quarter-inch audio reel-to-reel tape. Unfortunately, they didn't write down or adequately record what that speed was. They were never able to recover the masters. Good work. Some other great examples of complete clusterfucks that came out of attempting to simply put magnetic substrates onto a piece of ribbon or tape, destroying and losing huge amounts of data, include when Bass F fucked up the cobalt binding mixture and led to it all flaking off. Very similar to Ampex doing it with an oxide. 3M Scotch tape adhesive was an absolute mess. It clogged up machines, created melted chocolate like sludge inside of players that were trying to use their tape. Russia attempted to do a magnetic tape, and instead of getting it right, basically contaminated it with iron filings, which iron's not magnetic or nothing, right? TDK in the 1990s decided that they could do better with their bonding agent, and this is in the 90s, and it's TDK, and TDK was cheap to begin with, and they fucked it up, and they completely routed the binding agent, so all of the magnetic shit would fall off their tapes again. Like, it's not that hard. I'm going through a big fucking list here. At the end of the day, all you need to do is create some sort of highly inert adhesive to stick to something which isn't too... Oh, shit. Here we go. Why are tapes not good? Because you have a core ribbon, or it can be plastic, it can be polyester, cotton, it doesn't matter, which is then doped with a magnetic substrate. The magnetic substrate holds the data. The core thing is the mechanical part of it. You're gonna have differences in the stretch and adhesion. It's never going to be perfect. I'm not a fucking material engineer, but I know that my fudge doesn't stick to its crust that well because they fucking bake at different temperatures. Diskettes, or floppy disks, are not unlike tape. But what you gotta think about is that tape is a linear medium. When you save something to it, it runs along the length, along time, and they're spools. So you can't really dynamically read from a tape. There are some protocols that allow you to sit there and spool the tape back and forth and read from it. And that's what you see in the background of Maxwell Smart or some other old fucking spy bullshit. Diskettes, and then later hard drives, they are essentially a magnetic substrate. Instead of being a long one, they're a round one, and they allow for the write head read head to move around more dynamically. That's really the difference between a magnetic disc and a magnetic tape. I went through heaps of tubs trying to find my old police interview tapes. I can only assume that I couldn't find them in the tubs because of the fact that they were labelled always remain property of New South Wales Police. That's where they went. I thought it was pretty hilarious that well after the turn of millennium, the only way I could get a recording of my interviews with the police was on cassette. And actually, if I was a police team at that point in time, I would have done like the 4-track thing. I would have intentionally put it on different channels of the cassette so that it was impossible to listen to with a standard cassette player. That would have been pretty funny because all the data was there. Does that make me an asshole? Maybe I should have been a policeman. Maybe I am one. No. We've lost a lot of data because of poor storage of tape. But we've lost a lot more in terms of optical discs and the bubbling effect, or just don't necessarily have the drive physical media. Data amnesia is a huge issue, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use these mechanisms. I still have the ability to play my Chartbusters 1 with Billy Ocean, Sabrina Tiffany, Fleetwood Mac, and Icehouse. Because I still have an expensive Sony digital screen Walkman, and the Walkman didn't skip. And to be honest, I used Walkmans for a great number of years, mainly to listen to my own police recordings. I sounded very sexy, explaining to them how I didn't commit that crime. They still have their place as a cold storage. You've got to spin up solid state drives and hard drives repeatedly to keep them aware, for the want of a better way to word it. Magnetic tape. Look, if we can continue to improve the way that we layer the doping of magnetic materials over the underlying substrate, we'll do well. And I think the answer there is that we always will. But I don't care if we don't. Just to close this out, one of my first experiences as a young computer geek was walking into the computer shop where they had walls of games and walls of applications, and they were all aimed at the Apple or the Apple II or the Amiga. Me, being a young fella of about this high, walked up to someone who had a pen in his top pocket and glasses and greasy hair to the side, and I asked him, "Do you sell VIC-20 cassette games?" And man, I wasn't even in primary school at this point. I was like 4. And the dude tapped the shoulder of one of his other colleagues, laughing, going, "This kid wants to get cassette games." No. You know what? Fuck you, old man. We can be better than that. I'm Thaddeus McNamara. This is Whacking On.